Very exciting to see what Magnus does. He plays his pawn up to d4. And Ivanchuk now decides to go d5. Ivanchuk is one of those players who can play just about any opening. And he's very well versed with all sorts of systems. Knight f3 played by Carlsen, and Ivanchuk can go for c6, e6, knight f6, many possibilities. There's definitely some logic behind Magnus playing knight f3 first and not c4, but we are not aware of what he's thinking. e6 played by Ivanchuk, a flexible move. Maybe at some point you might want to try for this triangle system and stone wall without developing your knight. Pawn up to c4 by Magnus. Ivanchuk has played amazingly well in this tournament, and for his age he is doing some amazing feats in this tournament. Knight comes out to f6, and will Magnus play his favorite Catalan, or will he go knight c3? These are essentially the two main moves. He goes for g3, the Catalan, and now Ivanchuk has to choose from many options that he has. He can take the pawn, he can play bishop e7, or he can even give this check. He decides to give the check on b4, and it's generally an idea where you provoke white to block and then just drop your bishop back. That's how the plan continues. Bishop d2 played by Magnus, and Ivanchuk places his bishop back and tells Magnus that, hey, this is not the most ideal square for your bishop, so you would anyway have to move it later, so I don't lose a tempo. Also, this is a very solid system. Once you play this, you are intending to play solidly, not to take on c4, but rather play c6, b6, bishop b7, knight d7, and so on. And there you see Ivanchuk bolstering his center with the move c6. Magnus plays his queen to c2. This is a good spot for the queen. It's active and generally very useful. It also defends c4. Ivanchuk plays his knight to d7, and Magnus can castle here. That is one of the main lines. Also, there is bishop f4. He goes bishop f4, and well, somewhere it feels like Magnus doesn't want to castle too soon. He has some ideas in mind, and there's a very interesting move that Magnus has played in such positions after black castles here, which Ivanchuk does. And let's see if Magnus plays it. He has already played it with Sarana as well as Ding Liren, and that move is h4 here. Because it's a very interesting move. Magnus plays it. The idea of this move is to perhaps gain some space on the king side, also not to castle too soon, and some points you have your bishop that can move to g5. But you can see Ivanchuk plays d takes c4 pretty quickly, and he seems to be well prepared against h4 because Magnus has already played it. Queen takes c4, and in modern day chess, h4 has become a very common stay in many positions. So now knight d5, and imagine if the pawn wasn't on h4, you would have to drop your bishop back to d2. But now with the pawn here, you have an additional option of offering a trade of bishops. That's exactly what Magnus does, and this is the main point of one of the main points of playing h4. Ivanchuk, still in his prep it seems, plays his pawn up to h6, and this is very good preparation by Ivanchuk, because if you could guess that Magnus was going to play this line, you already have neutralized this opening, because black is roundabout even here. Now, one of the moves in this position is short castle. The other move is knight to c3. White plays pawn to e4, and Magnus is a little bit over ambitious, I would say, with this move, because he is having his king still in the center. His pieces are a little underdeveloped, but he wants to make sure that black does not get the c5 and e5 breaks. So knight b6 played by Ivanchuk, hitting the queen, and next move, if he can play c5, That would be really, really strong. Already he has equalized out of the opening. Where can Magnus play his queen is the question. Do you play here, here? He goes to c3. And now c5 makes so much sense because you are hitting this center. However, there is a very nice move here, which is to play e5. It's a pawn sack. Ivanchuk has 1 hour 27 minutes. He has to figure out if this works. Because if you take pawn takes, oh, he takes 12 minutes and finds it. The point is, if you take here, the knight jumps and hits the queen. If you play queen b3, my knight comes here, and then there is trouble. And if you go queen c2, there is queen b4 check. And because of all these variations, Magnus said, I'm castling it out. But Ivanchuk, you can see, he came back, he wrote his score sheet while standing up. He knows that he's equalized in this position very comfortably. Magnus has not gotten any opening advantage. And that is already good news for Ivanchuk. He takes on d4. And Magnus will most likely take with the queen, or it's also possible to take with the knight. Both moves make a lot of sense. You can see Magnus taking his time. He's definitely not very happy with the way the opening has gone, and Ivanchuk, with all his understanding and knowledge of chess, has managed to equalize here. Now you can put your knight on c5. This is a great square for the knight. Hitting e4 pawn, preparing rook d8. It's an amazing move. Also possible is knight f6 to put pressure there. Ivanchuk does play his knight to c5, and I love how he plays his pieces so slowly but places them on the right in the center of the squares. And now Magnus's e4 pawn is hanging. So if you're going to take time to do this, then already Ivanchuk is hitting on the d3 square. But Magnus goes rook c1 and he tells Ivanchuk, take this pawn, be my guest, because then I'll pin you, and if you try to save it, I'll attack you again. But this is not so bad. In fact, after rook d8, black should be completely fine. And Ivanchuk should have gone for this, I believe. He goes knight a6. And perhaps somewhere in his mind, he wants to get the knight to e6. And that could be one of his ideas. And lovely move by Magnus, knight bd2. This is something we all have to learn from Magnus. Like, the most natural move seems knight on c3. But this knight is a bit dominated there. So you put your knight on d2, you bolster the other knight. And when Ivanchuk plays bishop g4, and I think it's a logical move, the bishop is well placed. You also, when you put your knight on e6, you don't want your bishop to be blocked in inside. So you play your bishop here. Magnus now plays bishop f1. He sees that the bishop doesn't really have scope on this diagonal, and he doesn't want to push the pawn just as yet. So he's activating the bishop from here. Ivanchuk now plays his rook to d8, hitting the queen. And also this move bishop f1 comes in very handy to control the d3 square. As you will notice now with Ivanchuk's rook, he's not only attacking the queen, he's also looking at the d3 square. So when Magnus will move his queen here, Ivanchuk could have gotten his knight and tried to come in with knight b4 and so on. So queen e3 played by Magnus, and now you will notice the usefulness of bishop f1 move. If you go knight b4, there's already a3 and the knight cannot enter these squares. So Ivanchuk now doesn't want, his structure to be completely ruined. So perhaps knight c7 makes a lot of sense here. He plays knight c7 and Magnus goes pawn to a4. Ivanchuk places his knight to c8. I really like Magnus's a4 move because he's gaining space. You saw in the opening he played h4. Now he's playing a4, a5 and trying to clamp down the black's queen side. And Ivanchuk makes a positional error, a big mistake here. He should have maybe played rook fe8 and the position is still very balanced. But now when he takes, knight takes, you realize that the position is getting a bit stressful here. Black knights are not playing. White's bishop does look a bit passive right now, but Magnus has some grand plans for it. We will get to see in a bit. And after a6, rook a4 is played here by Magnus. Magnus has got his rook here beautifully positioned. This is a great rook lift. Ivanchuk plays his rook f to e8, and he is putting pressure on the e4 pawn. e5, and this is where Magnus's brilliance comes to light. He's giving up this square, but in return he wants to place his bishop here, get his queen here, and start an attack. Also the rook can swing over to g4 if needed. Brilliant play and excellent understanding of the various positional nuances. The knight comes in and attacks the queen. The queen moves to the side and puts pressure on the b7 pawn. So if you see, the a pawn has clamped down the king side, and the h pawn hopes to do the same on the king side. Knight a7 played by Ivanchuk. He wants to play his knight to b5. And Magnus's plan is very clear. Get the bishop to d3, put it back to b1, queen c2, launch an attack there. Yes, he plays his bishop to d3. Now for Ivanchuk, very important to meet it prophylactically. Like here, go e6, queen c2, knight f8, and you're fine. But instead, he makes an error. He goes after bishop d3, knight to b5, and now there's no time because bishop b1, excellent move by Magnus. How do you meet this move, queen c2? There's no time for this knight to reach f8 square here. So he needs to actually, if he goes g6, there'll be h5. So Ivanchuk has to make this very unfavorable move, h5, just so that he can meet queen c2 with g6. That is his point. But Magnus now plays rook e1. He realizes that when he goes queen c2 and Ivanchuk plays g6, he wants to get the e6 break in. That would just destroy black's position. So Ivanchuk goes and plans to put his knight on e6, so that after g6 his entire structure is very well placed. What does Magnus do now? He plays his queen to c2, threatening a check on h7. Ivanchuk quickly plays his pawn up to g6, and now there is a rash move, which is g4 takes, rook takes, and then you want to blast open the king side. Will Magnus play it? You know, there are some moves you say it's not in Magnus's style, but Magnus really has no style. He's a universal player and he may play it. But he goes bishop a2, very logical, king g7, and now g4 definitely makes sense. Or do you want to sack a pawn with e6, but then there is f5. So Magnus goes knight g5. Again, a great move. Looking at the e6 square, and now Ivanchuk can no longer get his knight there. Rook f8 played by Ivanchuk. He's defending his f7 pawn. How should Magnus continue this attack? Oh, he pushes the pawn in. And the point is that if you play f5, which is very, very logical, the dark squares become weak. So queen could land back on c1 looking at these squares, and the knight could jump in. Ivanchuk plays only one square forward. He plays his pawn to f6 and asks Magnus's knight to leave as soon as possible. And the knight doesn't want to leave. It says, I'm on a good square, I don't want to go. And so bishop b1, fantastic move played by Magnus. If you take the knight, there's a queen g6, queen h5, it's just falling apart, and you can never put your queen in, because even when I exchange the queens, there's e7 forking the two rooks. So that's the reason why f5 was played. And now queen c1, again looking at these darkened squares, knight f7 coming in, rook comes to d5. And there are many different ways in which Magnus can take advantage of this. I still think knight f7 is a fantastic move, but also you can go bishop a2 again, hit the rook. That is amazing. You know, the way in which Magnus has managed to outplay Ivanchuk positionally is amazing, because you know, when you look at players like Ivanchuk, you would think that they might not be great at opening theory or tactics, but positional play is something that they would excel in with all their chess understanding. But here's Magnus outplaying them by just pure little improving moves. Queen e3 played, the queen is well positioned, the knight comes to d5 attacking the queen. Where do you put your queen? Queen e5 check looks like an obvious move, but maybe then the knight drops back. So Magnus would try to somehow break through. He goes queen to d2. He puts his queen on a decent square and is angling at the king side dark squares. Ivanchuk goes rook to f6. He's keeping an eye on this e6 pawn, but it's firmly protected. Also, the knights don't really have great squares to go to. So first pawn comes to b4, hitting the rook. Where can the rook go is the question. The rook moves to c3, supported by both the knights. But now you can just take knight, yes, bishop takes, pawn takes, and I guess you can take the pawn there, right? It's a free pawn. Nothing's defending it. Black is attacking nothing. His kingside pieces are completely tied up, and so might as well capture the pawn. Generally, you don't want to take such pawns because when you have a positional advantage, but here it is not reduced. Yes, Ivanchuk wants to create counterplay. That's the reason why he plays f4, and he wants to open up the position with his rooks looking here. And this might be his last attempt to getting some counterplay, but Magnus is ready to ruin his structure. He takes here, and he tells Ivanchuk, if you take this one, then I give you a check. If you go back, I already have many different moves. Now this is a pin you don't like. Rook d1, rook d7 threatened. So gf4, very bold move. Now you are 2 pawns up. So Ivanchuk has to decide now what to do. Taking the pawn is not great, but then again, it does look that white king is a bit exposed. So he goes rook to f5, and now Magnus can drop back his queen to e4 and keep his 2 extra pawns. Ivanchuk does not have great scope in the position. There's nothing much he can do. The knight on g5 is an absolute monster. It controls all the important squares. Now Magnus plays his queen back to e4, and Ivanchuk is again, every move that Ivanchuk has to make is not so easy because there are no real great moves that he has, and rook d1 is really a big threat. The other rook can actually enter the fray very soon. Rook a2, rook d2, and that should be game over. So Ivanchuk there just moving his eyebrows there, trying to figure out what to do, and he resigns. He gives in. Magnus has